Hi, folks. I'm Audrey Kriva from Sustainable Business Consulting, and I'm so excited to be here at the Unpack 22 conference with you all. This presentation is going to be talking about the unexpected impacts of plastics and their alternatives, as well as some actionable steps that we can all take to intervene. So let's get started. If we were live, I would ask maybe some people to pipe in with an answer to this question. When you think of the plastic crisis, what comes to mind? In the past, when I've asked this question, I've gotten answers like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch or the recycling system, even that terrible, awful viral video of a turtle getting a straw pulled out of its nose. I don't like to remember that one. But you'll notice that in all of these cases, we're thinking about the sort of end of life of plastic once it's already been produced and used, and now it's being disposed of and perhaps it's escaped into the environment. And what I'd like to do at the beginning of this presentation is expand our lens on this a little bit and think about plastics and their impacts across their entire life cycle. So plastics, of course, begin well before they wind up in the environment or up some poor turtle's nose with being extracted from raw materials. They're then processed, used, often in the case of packaging, for a pretty brief period of time, and then disposed of and through a couple of possible different avenues. And we're going to focus on each of these life cycle stages and some of the impacts that are associated with them. Starting with extraction. So you may be aware that plastic is made from the same raw materials as fossil fuels, things like coal and oil, as well as natural gas. And one of the impacts of plastics that isn't commonly talked about is its economic relationship to our dependence on fossil fuels. And that's because the very same companies that produce our gasoline, our natural gas, are the ones who are ultimately responsible for plastic. So this is becoming especially relevant as the world is starting to look at decarbonizing our energy infrastructure and our transportation infrastructure. Some of those major fossil fuel companies you probably know are looking around at their very expensive oil reserves and thinking about what can we possibly do with these fossil fuels we haven't yet extracted and maybe won't have an opportunity to sell going into the future. And what many of those companies are turning to is plastic. And we can see this in the build out currently over the past 5 or so years and planned for the next 20 of plastics infrastructure, the types of facilities that turn raw materials like ethane into things like polyethylene, are plastics. So even as we're starting to see companies, even big oil companies, commit to being a part of recycling coalitions, circular economy organizations. They're also investing billions and billions of dollars into introducing virgin plastics into the economy. So that's all to say that even as we're looking at solutions to this problem, we can expect it to get bigger in the coming years. And we can't forget that plastic is tied to the climate crisis as well. So that's extraction. Let's think about processing. The key thing that I'd like to bring up in terms of processing is actually another invisible impact of plastics, environmental injustice. And that's because of where the plastics infrastructure, the processing facilities, are commonly located. You won't find them in rich suburban neighborhoods. These are usually sited in poorer areas and commonly in communities of color, which means that those communities are exposed to the health impacts and the health risks associated with being near the off-gassing and the gases that this production process releases, as well as exposed to the impacts when failures happen. So we've seen, for example, lots of communities in Texas that have been under lockdown orders, not able to go outside due to malfunctioning nearby plastic facilities. So just because certain people don't feel those impacts doesn't mean that somebody isn't. Environmental justice is a huge part of the plastic life cycle. The next thing I'd like to talk about is use. This is something that more and more people are learning about, but plastics are, the production of plastics includes a ton of different types of additives. So those are things like colorants or plasticizers, which make things more rubbery, those kinds of things. And many of those additives are actually known to be toxic to animals, both to humans and to our furry friends. So some of the impacts of additives to plastic are cancers, birth defects, reproductive effects, endocrine disruption. These kinds of things are not major effects, of course, in just a single exposure, but over a lifetime of eating food that's been packaged alongside these toxic substances, it has a really big impact. So the use side of plastics is nothing to sniff at as well. And finally, let's look at disposal. So this is the most visible aspect of the plastic crisis. But I want to talk about some of the ways that disposal can go wrong. There are basically four different places that plastic can wind up after its useful life. It can be recycled, which is optimal. It can wind up in a standard disposal mechanism, such as in the air through an incinerator or in a landfill. Or finally, it can escape from intended collection systems and wind up in the environment as leakage. So you can see here on the slide the percentages of plastic production annually that winds up in each of these four pathways. You'll notice that recycling is awful low at only 14%. And that's actually even a generous estimate. Only about 2% of annual plastic production actually gets recycled in a closed loop fashion back into the type of packaging or material that it was originally. Even the material that's collected for recycling is commonly either discarded because it's contaminated. You may have heard some of that as the recycling system has struggled over the last couple of years, or it's what we call downcycled or cascaded into lower quality materials, things like plastic park benches, that kind of thing. So recycling is often looked to as a solution for the plastic crisis, but it faces some really big challenges. And ultimately, without some major system redesign, isn't set up to be a good solution to the plastic production that we have. And as you'll recall, we're situated to have more and more virgin plastic pumped into the system, meaning that recycling is not set up to be as fully functional as one would hope. Some of the other places, of course, that the plastic can wind up after its life cycle is in the air, which is bad for health for obvious reasons. The landfill, which is bad for nature because of the loss of toxins, the bleeding of toxins, into water, which gets into the environment. And finally, leakage, which is worse than all of the above because it winds up with plastic directly in the environment, which is terrible for a whole ton of reasons, including that plastic breaks down into what we call microplastics, which get ingested by animals of all shapes and sizes and work their way up the food chain to harm all sorts of animals and humans. So that is a little bit of the behind the scenes peek at what is happening in the plastics life cycle beyond what we already know is a problem. And I'd like to now think about what we might do differently. And thinking about the people in this room and at this conference, we're not producers of plastic. We aren't recyclers. We are mostly engaged at the use phase. So we are going to focus our solutions on that phase as well. So we all agree that plastic is a big problem. And I'd like to look at the circular economy as a solution. So as we define the circular economy, I want to look to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, an authority on this topic, to help us define some of the principles that we should look to for plastic, for a better plastic system. So I'm going to quickly run through 6 different principles, and then we'll talk about the specific alternatives that you might implement that that bring these principles to life. So the first principle of the circular economy for plastic is elimination of problematic or unnecessary plastic packaging. This is a pretty common sense solution, of course, but I want to note the words problematic and unnecessary. So problematic plastic are things that are not easy to recycle or cause contamination of other types of recycling, or have huge health impacts. And unnecessary plastic, I think you can imagine what this means. Things like shrink wrapping for our bananas in the grocery store. Who needs that? Totally unnecessary. The second principle of the circular economy for plastics is that reuse models are applied where relevant, reducing the need for single-use packaging. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. The third principle is that all plastic packaging is 100% reusable, recyclable, or compostable. So these are 3 ways to manage the end of life of plastic and design for it to be, for no plastic to escape the collection systems. However, I also want to flag principle number 4, which is that all plastic packaging is reused, recycled, or composted in practice. Now, whereas the above is sort of a design question, making sure that everything that gets put into the world has an intended disposal mechanism that works. Number 4 is really about infrastructure and building systems that are in fact able to manage the packaging waste that we produce. Number 5 is that the use of plastic is fully decoupled from the consumption of finite resources. So think again to the virgin plastic I mentioned being pumped into the economy. That is not decoupled from the consumption of a finite resource. However, plastic packaging that's made from 100% recycled content does fulfill this principle. And finally, number 6, all plastic packaging is free of hazardous chemicals, and the health, safety, and rights of all people, and I would add animals, involved are respected. So this one's common sense. Looking at these principles as a whole, you can imagine how, if they're all able to be successfully implemented, we might build a system where the use of plastic doesn't cause the types of negative impacts that I just described in the previous couple of slides. But unfortunately, none of us has a magic wand where we can just build an ideal plastic system. We all have sort of a single slice that we can influence. And what most of you all are able to influence is the type of packaging that you use. So that mostly applies to these top 3 principles. And what I'd like to do is go through 3 alternatives to plastic, which are in varying states of available at this time, and talk about their pros as well as what is still kind of holding these alternatives back. So let's get to it. The first of the 3 alternatives, and the most optimal one, is to minimize or eliminate packaging. This is something that lots of companies have talked about and explored how to do, but it can be a little bit challenging. Let's start with the cons. So this This solution is not viable for all product types, especially thinking about products that can spoil, like food. They often need a certain type or really stringent requirements of packaging. So eliminating it altogether may not be possible. It's also true that items that have little or no packaging may not have the opportunity to have all the branding that that is part of the reason packaging exists in the first place. So there's a need to engage with customers in a different way if you're using this strategy. However, there are also some big pros. So we talked on the previous slide about decoupling economic growth from finite resource use. And this certainly does that. It allows your business to continue to grow and expand without having an increased footprint on the environment. Eliminating packaging avoids both the upstream and the downstream impacts of plastic and other packaging use, like I mentioned. And there's also increasingly some distribution infrastructure for packaging products without packaging or with minimal packaging. So obviously some hard goods like the pet toy that we have here on the screen already have their distribution systems. But thinking about food, there's been a big surge in bulk stores or package-free shops for food for people. And I'd like to propose that there's an opportunity for pet food to get involved in that as well. So for people to access their pet products without the need for packaging by going to a bulk store. And finally, products without packaging tend to have a positive consumer reception, especially with environmentally minded people. So this is the first of the three alternatives that we're going to go through. The second most preferable of the alternatives is reusable packaging. So let's talk about the pros of reusable packaging. Like eliminating packaging altogether, it decouples business growth from finite resource use because the packaging can continue to cycle through use without ever being disposed of. It also has some strong branding opportunities. If you look to the left of this screen, you'll see some messaging from Loop, a reuse infrastructure system that I'll explain in a second, and all of the ways that existing consumer goods companies have been branding putting their branding onto these reusable containers. And finally, again, among environmentally conscious consumers as well as others, there is a pretty positive consumer reception to reuse systems. So let me tell you a little bit more about Loop. Loop is run by a company called TerraCycle, and it's a system for distributing food as well as hygiene products, mostly in reusable packaging that then gets actually recollected and refilled by the company that produced the product. So TerraCycle manages the infrastructure of distributing and recollecting the reusable packaging, but and allows the production companies the consumer goods companies to distribute their products without impacting, without having to produce any packaging at all. So this, although I don't know of any pet products that are involved in Loop at this stage, I think that this model could work perfectly well for this industry. On the con side, environmentally speaking, although reuse systems work in some cases, it is also true that sometimes the emissions from transporting reusable packaging, which tends to be heavier because it's more durable, back and forth is can be higher than the emissions for a single-use package would have been. This is, of course, dependent on a ton of different factors, especially how far the product gets transported in each direction. But it's worth doing the calculation for in every sort of individual circumstance to make sure that we're not falling into a trap here where we trade something good for something bad for something worse. And in addition, another con to the reusable packaging world right now is that there isn't a ton of infrastructure available. And this is something I'd like to flag for you all. I think this is an area that in which we are really poised to grow. And the infrastructure systems are going to be introduced in the coming years for distributing products without the need for packaging. And one of my calls to action for you all is to keep an eye out for those opportunities as they become available, and think about being an early adopter and starting to use those opportunities to get your products to people without a major environmental impact. So that's reusable packaging. And the third and final alternative I'd like to talk with you all about is compostable packaging. So this may be something that you've heard about, or maybe even converted your packaging to. There are some big pros. First of all, unlike plastics, it's not fossil fuel based. Compostable packaging is made from biological materials. And it also tends to be a popular alternative for companies because it's an easy substitute into systems designed for plastic, especially compostable plastic alternatives like PLA, you may have heard of, can be introduced into packaging that's the same size or has the same basic functional specs as plastic might. And so it's a relatively cheap, easy substitute for companies. However, there are also some really big cons to compostables that are sometimes skated over, and I really want to make sure we talk about them today. So one is that we talked about in the Ellen MacArthur Foundation principles that things actually need to get reused, recycled, or composted in practice. And in the US right now, that is awful hard when it comes to composting. The collection infrastructure is pretty weak. Now, let's talk a little bit about what it means to compost something. You may know that naturally it means that the material will break down into a non-toxic biological material after it has after some period of time. But to label something as compostable in the US means that it will do that not under any circumstances, but only under a specific set of heat and moisture conditions. So in order for something to be compostable in practice, not only does it need to be made of biological materials, as I mentioned, it also needs to wind up in a compost facility. We call those usually industrial compost facilities that are designed to let these break down. And even if for compostable packaging that does wind up in the correct facility, one of the things we've heard from composters who manage this is that plastic substitutes like PLA are really slow to break down in practice and wind up taking tons of time and clogging up their systems that are really designed for proper organic materials like coffee grounds and carrot tops. In fact, there was a recent coalition of composters from Oregon who put together a press release and a statement that said, we're not going to accept any more plastic alternatives into our into our composting systems. They just don't work. So that's another struggle with composting. In addition, as I mentioned, compostable products are made from biological materials. Sometimes those materials are the same ones that we would have eaten or someone would have eaten otherwise, and they wind up competing or driving up the price. And finally, compostables are easily confused with bio-based or biodegradable plastics, which are not the same thing. Bio-based means it's made from biological materials, but not that it'll actually break down. And biodegradable means that it is that it will break down under some unspecified circumstances, unlike composting, which, as I mentioned, has a really specific definition. So, as you can tell from these three alternatives, unfortunately, there's no perfect solution to plastic. Everything is a trade-off, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and that we shouldn't take action. So I put together a couple of next steps that I would suggest that you consider as you attempt to make an impact on the plastic crisis. So one is to signal your commitment to this issue by making a plastic pledge. This can help build momentum and signal to the market that there's a desire for more and better plastic alternatives, things like reuse. The second is to advocate in your community, including around legislation. So that can be for better recycling infrastructure. Even though we know recycling isn't a perfect solution, it's a heck of a lot better than letting things leak into the environment. And you can advocate for municipal support of things like, as I said, reusable systems and support for bulk stores. If you must use plastic, it is much better to use recycled content, which drives up demand for recycling, for recycled materials and makes it more economically viable for recycling to work, and make sure that the design that you produce is itself recyclable. And finally, as I mentioned, the last thing that I'd suggest that you do is invest in overcoming the plastic crisis by investing in emerging solutions, especially things around reuse or eliminating packaging. So with those next steps in mind, let's have a conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Let's talk about plastics.